spread the good word to China, at the time they really had to learn the Confucian language before they would be able to spread the word to China. In other words, these Christian missionaries will have to be Confucianized before they would be able to become effective as interpreters or transmitters of the Christian message. And the emergence of what we call the Enlightenment movement in the West, in the 18th century in particular, is a spectacular phenomena. And then, of course, even today, we're very much a part of that particular ethos. But in the 18th century, some of the most brilliant minds in the West took Confucianism as the reference culture and China as the reference society. The assumption at the time was that Confucianism and Chinese culture in general, without any revelatory religion, the idea of God or the transcendent reality, managed to develop an ordered, civilized society comparable in sophistication to any of the well-developed societies in the West. So European intellectuals could benefit from learning from non-Western civilizations, especially Chinese civilization, and Confucianism in particular. Voltaire really glorified the Confucian culture. Leibniz was very pleased when he learned his own theoretical thinking was compatible with the Confucian ideas as expressed in the Book of Change and in some Neo-Confucian metaphysics. Many of the encyclopedists also were very, very impressed by the East Asian mode of thinking, especially Confucian humanism. In the 19th century, the situation dramatically changed with the emergence of the philosophy of Hegel. Hegel really believed that human history progressed according to the absolute spirit in an irreversible trajectory. And he speculated, even though human civilizations may have begun in many non-Western civilizations or cultures, such as India, China, Persia, and others, but it's the sunrise stage. These civilizations only represented the sunrise, the early initial stages of human civilization. Human civilization eventually will move to the West, like the sun eventually would set in the West. And this he considered as an irreversible trajectory. Some people then characterize it as historical inevitability. All these civilizations may have contributed to something, but eventually it is the West, the modern West, as Europe in particular, will be the culmination of great civilizations. And of course, he also believed that Germany was the ending point of this great historical development. And his philosophy may be the highest culmination of this process. So he then invented this notion about the end of history. The end of history, meaning major debates and arguments about human flourishing, will all be relegated to the background because we have one approach, one particular style, one form of life, which is, by all standards, by all ideas, really the highest manifestation of human progress. Now, this is a revisit of that phenomena today. But we know that from the 19th century, the dynamism of Europe was such that it gradually expanded and affected the rest of the world. Chinese intellectuals in the 19th century, especially those under the influence of Confucianism, fully embraced the West, the modern West, as the culminating point of human history. So learning to be modern, learning to be human in the modern sense, is to learn from the West. East Asian intellectuals, Chinese intellectuals in particular, for 150 years have been devoted students of Western learning. So they are all very much seasoned in this particular line of thinking. So after the Cold War, in very recent history, after the Cold War, with the unification of the two Germanys and the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, there was a euphoria in America in particular. And the idea of the end of history was promoted by Francis Fukuyama, who was at the time a consultant at Rand Corporation, and happily announced that now this is only one model for human flourishing. And fortunately, the model is the American model, the model we're familiar with. The market economy rather than the planned economy, capitalism rather than socialism, democracy rather than any form of authoritarianism, human rights rather than any kind of concern for obedience to authoritarian state. The values that we cherish in modern America, we are very familiar with all these great values of liberty, equality, human rights, rule of law, dignity of the person, individualism. And these are the values, and even the idea of the adversarial system, division of labor in the government, the dynamism of the market, and the vibrance of the civil society, and incredible intellectual power of educational system. All these things we exemplify in modern America should be the model for further development of human flourishing. Even though there was a challenger from the former Soviet Union and from China, the so-called socialist country, but with the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, these kind of contending forces subsided, and there's only one way of learning to be human in terms of human flourishing. So the notion about the end of history is from Hegel. There's one trajectory, and we embody that particular trajectory. So the notion, I think one Indian scholar said, one of the most difficult thing for him to accept when they talk to many of the American intellectuals is the impression that our present is your future. And our past, in fact, our past is your present. So we've experienced what you've experienced. We've reached this point, and your aspiration is to be more like us. Implicitly in that, so America becomes the great teaching civilization for the rest of the world. Just at the same time, at about this time, and one of our colleagues in the political science, Sam Huntington, developed a notion about the coming clash of civilizations. As a political scientist, never very much interested in culture, he suddenly decided that in the future, in the 21st century, major conflicts in the world would not be simply economic conflict, political conflict, or even military conflict, but would be religious, societal, and cultural conflicts, the civilizational conflicts. And these conflicts will be the most difficult to deal with. And these conflicts may turn out to be the most explosive. Now you can say that Fukuyama's position is very optimistic. Human history is going to follow the same trajectory. And there's no more major debates and arguments. The American way is the way for the future. And some Huntington says, no, that's not the case. There are other cultures that may threaten this particular development. Now, Sam Huntington's argument is based upon the cultural spheres in the world. The world can be divided, according to him, about 8 or 9 cultural spheres. And of course, it is now highly debatable. Some scholars develop a much more elaborate cultural map, but now it is in vogue in political science to talk about different cultural maps, not just geographic, ethnic divisions, but also in terms of major cultural components. The largest and the most important cultural universe is, of course, the Christian. The Western European societies, certainly North American societies, could all be considered as this Christian world, both the Catholic and the Protestant. And you can even enlarge it to include the Eastern Orthodox tradition. That's the former Soviet Union or Russia and Eastern European societies. That's a very large block. And of course, there are internal conflicts and tensions, no question about that. And then there's also the Islamic world in the Middle East, in Asia. This is the Confucian world with China, Korea, Vietnam. And Sam Huntington, in a curious way, decided Japan is not in the Confucian world. Japan is independent as a cultural arena, because he strongly believed that alliance between the United States and Japan is absolutely critical, because Japan was economically extremely powerful and vibrant. But then there are other societal components, India to be sure, Southeast Asia and so forth, Australia, New Zealand. But he basically ignored Africa and considered Africa is a problem. Africa is not going to be a major competitor for resources for economic development. So it's a highly Europe-centered or American-centered discourse. So even though Sam Huntington's position about coming clash of civilizations is on the surface diametrically opposed to Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, Sam Huntington really, both of them subscribe to the thesis that may be called the West and the rest. The Western world and the rest. And the argument is that unless the West is able to develop, to be stable, to develop, there's no world peace. There's no real sustainable pattern of human flourishing. So it's absolutely necessary for the West, especially under the leadership of the United States, to consolidate its power with alliance with Western European societies, and hopefully with Japan, because Japan is highly democratized, it's now G7. And so in order to fight against two threats, civilizational threats to the modern West, one is from the Islamic world, we know that, Islamic fundamentalism. But curiously, there's also the threat from his point of view from the Confucian world, particularly from China. Whether China is considered as Confucian world or not, that's a complicated issue. But this perception of the world is based upon conflict, tension, us, them. The radical otherness will have to be silenced. And it's not a celebration of diversity. It is the idea of the unfolding of human history according to a certain kind of inner logic. And if we do not protect our interests, eventually we'll be overwhelmed by forces from the outside. And this position, in terms of the domestic manifestation, is a serious concern, a serious worry about multiculturalism, about diversity, about conflict within the United States, especially racial conflict. So it is not simply a theory about global history, it's also a theory about how domestic policies will have to be worked out. In 1990, I was in the East-West Center. I initiated a conversation at the time we called the Dialogue of Civilizations. And we managed to get scholars from all major religious traditions, from Judaism, from Christianity, from Islam, from Hinduism, from Jainism, from Confucianism, Taoism, and well, you never heard of Jainism, so let me write it down here. It's one of the great South Asian religions, and in fact, non-violence, ahimsa, non-violence. Gandhi's idea of non-violence came from Jainism, more from Jainism than from Hinduism or Buddhism. So it is a major religious tradition. And also scholars from Japanese Shintoism and indigenous religious traditions. And for 2 or 3 years, we worked very, very hard to talk about the necessity of the dialogue of civilizations, to celebrate diversity, to understand, hopefully to develop some kind of mutual understanding through interreligious dialogue. But very little attention, attracted very little attention, just a very small circle of friends and like-minded people and intellectuals trying to explore those kind of issues. But when the coming clash of civilization was first announced in 1993, it generated incredible discussion all over the world. And so it's the clash of civilization that attracted everybody's attention. The question of dialogue was relegated to the background. But after a while, it's very, very interesting, after a while, the recognition that pluralism is going to stay. No matter how strong America is, or how strong America plus European Union could become, the world is not going to be overwhelmed by one particular form. The pluralistic world will remain the same, and it may become even more diversified. And the felt need for dialogue is absolutely critical. Now we know the situation in the Middle East or in the Balkan countries, but more than that, within our society, the necessity for dialogues cross-culture, cross-religious, cross-ethnic lines. So even though for about 5 years, the clash of civilization attracted a great deal of attention, especially in the mass media, and gradually it was the dialogue of civilization that re-emerged as a more enduring discussion. I've been part of an ongoing seminar on culture and globalization organized by Sam Huntington and Peter Berger at the Boston University. And now the consensus that if the clash of civilization becomes imminent or difficult to avoid, then dialogue becomes even more imperative. It's the only way out. And of course, we all know, if I go through this process, you know how idealistic that is. But despite the idealism, almost there's no way out. This is the only way that human survival, leaving aside the ecological problem, human survival can be assured. These are the conditions for dialogue. Dialogue is different from just tolerance. We know in interreligious communication, people teach tolerance and say absolutely necessary for tolerance. I think it's a minimum requirement. If you cannot tolerate the existence of someone else who is different, then conflict, tension, struggle becomes unavoidable. So we have to learn to be tolerant. I think it has something to do with the idea of reciprocity. But tolerance is very limited sense of recognizing the significance of the other. If you tolerate something or tolerate someone, there's no liking involved. You can say that the Israelis and Palestinians really had to learn to tolerate each other. Otherwise, the conflict became unavoidable. But I think even in that conflict, it moved a little bit beyond tolerance. That is the awareness of coexistence is inevitable. The awareness can turn out to be very negative. It's a passive notion. I cannot eliminate my enemy. I know that without a major cost. And the cost is so great. At this juncture, I cannot do it. So not only I have to tolerate his or her existence, I have to allow her existence to be an integral part of my awareness. So allow the existence of someone. But there's very little contact. There's little communication. Just the awareness that the intolerance will lead to serious conflict. So we have to be tolerant and at the same time to recognize the coexistence. But recognition is a much more positive mental awareness to already become not only concerned, but at the same time become critically aware of the necessity of some kind of communication. You have to, we call it the politics of recognition. You know, when the minorities, when the people who are privileged, or who are underprivileged, who are marginalized, who are silenced, they begin demonstration. The first demonstration is to show that they have a voice. Their voice has to be audible, and the voice has to be recognized. So the politics of recognition is to say, look, I exist. You have to recognize me. You cannot just marginalize me. You cannot just put me in a safe haven without paying any attention to me. You need to recognize. The politics of recognition is absolutely critical. And you become aware, you have to recognize. Recognize is not just aware of someone there, but become more actively involving, understanding that situation. Now, recognition is, of course, more positive than simply being aware and to try to tolerate or to be aware of the existence of someone. But still, there may not be a real communication going on. I recognize that we disagree. I recognize your existence, but I really don't want to do anything with you. I recognize your needs. Once I made an observation, and many of my friends became angry at me and felt that I was a bit harsh on the American foreign policy. I want to repeat it just briefly about the great problem we faced in the 60s involving in Vietnam. This is, of course, a history that is still now being reenacted, because all kinds of new developments. It is a tragedy for Vietnam, to be sure, but also a tragedy for the United States. I think it really affected the American soul. And you're too young to remember what actually happened. But it was a major problem, a major change of American life orientation. And part of the problem, among all the other military issues and political issues, is this, I would say, this arrogance or even insensitivity. That is to say, I want to help you. I think it's very important for me to help you, and you need help. And I know what is best for you. And I'm going to invest a great deal of time and energy, resources, and even our human lives in order to see to it that you'll be able to fight against communist encroachment and so forth. And yet, never enter into my mind that I need to understand you. I certainly don't like you. Not that I despise you. I don't think I have time and energy and any kind of willingness to know your history, to know your culture, to know your existential situation. But I know what is best for you, because given the trajectory of human progression, if you're able to fight against the encroachment from communism, you'll be able to develop a stable polity. Eventually it can become democratic, you can become a vibrant economy and so forth. So we really have to do that. So there's no question about tremendous investment of time and energy, but something is missing. That something is reciprocal respect. There's no reciprocal respect because there's no understanding, there's no willingness to share. I also was involved in a series of discussion in Copenhagen, ever since the Social Summit in 1995. Denmark is the only country, developed societies in the world, that has made a commitment through national election to make 1% of the GNP of the country for foreign aid. It's incredible. The amount is certainly the highest. Denmark, with a population of 5 million, but with a very vibrant economy, a large amount of money involved. 25 years ago, the United States, together with other developing societies, made a commitment, made a pledge, not a legal commitment, but made a pledge that the United States would spend 0.7 of the GNP, together with all other developing societies, to help the developed society to help the underdeveloped. The percentage dropped from 0.7 all the way to 0.1 and 0.07, something of that nature. And now the actual amount of money we spend was lower than Japan's, probably Germany's, and even France. So we're just going down. And so Denmark made a major commitment of 1% to do that. And the target countries turn out to be all in Africa. So Denmark is very much involved in aid to Africa. But in the meeting, I realized there's something very interesting, because they impose what they call conditionalities. Conditionalities meaning that all these African countries will live up to the expectations of the Danish government about public accountability, about transparency. Before you meet all these requirements, we're not going to give you the money you need. They're afraid of corruption and so forth. Then I raised the question, is it possible to imagine that the recipient country is not simply a learning civilization, but also a teaching civilization? In other words, Denmark can learn from Ethiopia, from other societies, when these societies actually receiving money from Denmark. First, they were very surprised. Learn? What do you mean? Our purpose is really to help, to try to understand, to help. My argument then is, if you do not learn the culture, if you do not try to understand with a reciprocal respect, you will never be able to truly help in the long run, because what you need is capacity building. You're not going to give the money, you're going to build the capacity. Build the capacity they do, and the capacity building is really based upon reciprocal respect. And in Mencius, there's a very interesting statement, someone who's starving to death and needed food. And the guy who decided to give him some food and say, hey, this is the food, get it. And the guy was so angry at this kind of a despise, and in respect, he decided to starve to death without taking that food, because that kind of contempt was unbearable. This is just one example. And that is to say, the reciprocal respect is based upon, this is also true with teaching. We all know that. If the teacher is not a good student, the teacher can never be a good teacher, because it's really through learning from you, in a sense. Not only your critical reflection, but your puzzlement, your frustration, your concern, your worry, and then the teaching can continue. So there's always a reciprocal relationship between teaching and learning. So Xunzi made it very clear, if there's no possibility of learning, the teacher can never be a good teacher. So that reciprocal respect is based upon, the relationship is totally asymmetrical. I have all the resources, and you are the recipient of all the resources. But if I do not understand you, appreciate you, and understand the dignity of the situation, existential situation, I'll never be able to truly help. But dialogue is based upon not only reciprocal respect, but based upon mutual referencing. I think I mentioned it before, the single most important bilateral relationship in the world today turns out to be, in terms of the world peace, the cultural peace, like Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, has pointed out, is the Sino-American relationship. And yet, the relationship is totally asymmetrical, in the sense that China's obsession with the United States, and the United States' disregard or inattention to China. We have so many other things that we need to worry about. China is one of those foreign policy issues that we don't have to worry about on a daily basis. And China is totally obsessed with America, both as a model and as a competitor. Now, mutual referencing based upon the idea that even though the relationship is asymmetrical, to use a country as a reference is to enhance one's self-reflexivity. My self-understanding, my self-knowledge is based upon my ability to understand someone else's impression of who I am. In other words, my self-understanding is not simply based upon my self-knowledge, but based upon my understanding of the projections that many of you may have about me. There's always this kind of a continuous interaction of the two. So dialogue then also from not just tolerance or recognition, reciprocal respect, but also mutual reference. If we look at the Israeli-Palestinian situation, I think they move from tolerance to mutual recognition and coexistence. For the first time, the Palestinians accept the fact that the State of Israel is going to exist and continue, and I think the State of Israel also recognizes. That's a major development of coexistence and recognition. But I think there's still a long way before they can develop reciprocal respect, not to mention mutual reference. But not necessarily the highest, the only reason that we need to involve in a dialogue is because the celebration of difference. If we accept pluralism as unavoidable, then to not only to accept difference, but to celebrate the otherness of the significant other. That is particularly difficult. Let me take from the Confucian point of view, why I want to enter into a dialogue with a Christian or a Buddhist or a Muslim. Not only because through dialogue there will be mutual understanding, some kind of mutual understanding with mutual respect, then the conflict and tension will be overcome because we look at the world differently. More positive sense is that no civilization, no matter how great, how comprehensive, is so comprehensive that all the values in human history can be fully realized. Each civilization has its own trajectory, so has its own limitations, its own, as well its own strengths. And if a civilization is going to grow, to develop, it has to open itself up to other possibilities. And in fact, all major civilizations in the world become syncretic in some way. Syncretic in the sense of being influenced by other forces. You open, like the self. If the self is a flowing stream rather than an isolated island, the self will have to interact with other selves, other streams to enrich its own stream. So the dynamic transformation of a living tradition requires that it opens up to other possibilities, to know other dimensions of the human experience. So if I wanted to enter into a dialogue with the Christian tradition, my general sense is because there's something that I can truly learn from that tradition in such a way that my own tradition can become enriched. Upon self-reflection, there are major defects of my own tradition. So you enter into a dialogue with the understanding that out of the communication you're going to change, dramatically change your mind. So to celebrate, in the following sense, I celebrate a Christian to be a genuine Christian because by communicating with a genuine Christian, I, as a Confucian, will become enriched. You have to imagine that in the Christian sense, between the Christian and the Muslim, between the Buddhist and the Christian, or between the Hindu and the Jain, or Hindu and the Sikh. Is it possible? In most cases, it is not only difficult, almost virtually impossible. Normally, dialogues in interreligious context is a strategy of trying to develop a politics of recognition or even politics of identity. So the dialogue is to show the other side my faith, my understanding of the human situation, so the other side would be able to appreciate who I am. The intention is not necessarily to learn, but the intention is to become even more self-assertive. And this is going on all the time. So now the question, it's a big question, can the Confucian tradition serve for its own sake and for the sake of interreligious dialogue a special kind of function? This is the question. This question then is linked to the question of dual membership or dual citizenship. Can a person be both a Confucian and a Christian, a Confucian and Muslim, and Confucian Jew, Confucian Buddhist? So this is the question. I'm not asking in this context whether a Christian can be a Buddhist or a Muslim can be a Jew and so forth. That's a totally different question. And this question is predicated, you asked the, okay, go ahead.
Sorry,
no problem.
Are you implying that Confucianism is different from other major world religions?
This is precisely what I'm trying to say. Okay. We have a problem here in trying to say, is it a religion or not? You see, is it a secular ethics? Is it religion or not? I am one of those who try to underscore the religious dimension. Even though I try to underscore the religious dimension, I'm critically aware of what happened in interreligious dialogue, because I've been involved in quite a few of them now, in the Confucian Christian, Confucian Muslim, and Confucian Buddhist. One phenomena is undeniable. That is, for example, in a Buddhist Christian dialogue, John Bertrand has been involved in directing quite a few of those discussions. Normally, we're very clear who are the Buddhists, who are the Christians. In the Muslim-Christian dialogue, we know very clear the membership, the Christians and the Muslims. Or in the Jewish-Muslim dialogue or Islamic dialogue, we're also very clear. But in the Confucian dialogue with these other traditions, there's one very interesting situation about membership. I mentioned it before. The first time I was involved in that discussion, the 15 so-called Confucians and 15 Christians. Out of the 15 Confucians, 10 of them were Christians. So you have a situation, there are 20 Christians and 5 non-Christian Confucians. And out of the 10 Confucian Christians, the Confucian Christians, and they were involved in a dialogue representing the Confucian point of view with their fellow Christians. That is, partly answer to your question. It's a strange phenomenon, but it's also intriguing. And I, as a non-Christian Confucian, let me call myself Confucian, I find that very encouraging. I didn't find that threatening at all. At the time of the discussion, I was not even aware that Bob Neville, one of the readers, John Bertrand, they're Christians. But they were representing the Confucian tradition in talking to other Christians. I was in Malaysia. I was involved in the Islamic Confucian dialogue. And there were a number of Muslims from China, and quite a few of them actually confided to me. They said, we could characterize ourselves as Confucian Muslims. And this is true with Buddhists as well. Now, this we call it dual membership. This dual membership situation, if you look at East Asia, look at the situation in East Asia, it's not difficult to understand. And Ambassador Reischauer, I mentioned earlier, in talking about the religious situation in Japan, made the following observation, that 70% of the Japanese are Buddhists, maybe 80% of them are Shintoists. When they are Buddhists and Shintoists, they do not deny they're also under the influence of Confucian ethics. So he's saying the possibility of a Japanese to call himself or herself as a Shinto Buddhist Confucian, or Confucian Shinto Buddhist. In other words, mixing memberships. Peter Berger, who visited Singapore once and was very, very sort of overwhelmed by this kind of syncretism and considered it's a secular, modern secular form. It's not authentic. It's not true religion, just mixing all these things together. But we have to think, why a Shinto can be a Buddhist, why a Shintoist and a Buddhist can also be a Confucian. It's interesting, it's an interesting model. Now, if you call yourself a Confucian Christian, or a Confucian Muslim, or a Confucian Buddhist, the word Confucian is an adjective. And that adjective should have a special meaning. What does it mean by being a Confucian Christian? What is the difference between a Confucian Christian and a non-Confucian Christian? You have to ask the same question. And once it becomes an adjective, and my suggestion, which some people feel very encouraged by this and some people feel very confused, I want you to use the word Confucian in reference to what I discussed as the public intellectual, as the idea of the public intellectual, in the following sense. A public intellectual is someone who is politically concerned, socially engaged, and culturally sensitive or informed. No matter what profession the person is, whether it's in government or not in government, whether it's in the academic community, not community, when you graduate, you enter business. You become a lawyer, you become a medical doctor, you have a profession, you join a social movement, you take part in NGO, non-governmental organizations. There are all kinds of professions. The profession does not define whether you're a public intellectual or not. It's not an elitist idea. It is an attitude. The attitude is the person who is concerned, who is politically concerned. Doesn't mean that you become a politician. You may never want to become a politician, but you are politically concerned. A lot of people are not politically concerned. They're great academicians, they are great business people, they're great in their own professions of various kinds, but they are not politically concerned. But the public intellectual cannot but be politically concerned. And the public intellectual cannot but be engaged. Engaged in the Sartrean, existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre once made the observation, engaged, engagé, engaged intellectual. And he at one point said, only a Marxist can be an engaged intellectual. So I want to be an engaged intellectual, so I am a Marxist. Later many of his disciples, his followers, like Derrida and so forth, Foucault, and they felt not enough to be a Marxist. The only way you can be a truly engaged intellectual in Paris in 1968 is to be a Maoist. They're all Maoists. Foucault was a Maoist and Derrida was a Maoist. They, of course, changed their mind quickly. But anyway, this sense of being engaged in the social movement, in the political movement, and culturally sensitive. Now, there are a lot of people, let's say, in major religious traditions. They're not concerned about politics or engaged. And they are great theologians. They're great spiritual leaders. For example, a Buddhist who's interested in the other shore, not this world, other shore, interested in spiritual transformation of the person, enter into nirvana as the ultimate concern. And he's not interested in ecological questions, not interested in political questions, not interested in social issues, not interested in the globalizing process. And the person can still be a great Buddhist monk, a great Buddhist scholar, a great Buddhist spiritual leader. And that Buddhist leader would never identify himself or herself as a Confucian Buddhist, because it's out of the question. So it is in this sense that use the word Confucian necessarily involves a person to a particular orientation. The orientation is compatible with the Confucian idea. You have to recognize the sanctity of the earth. It's this worldly. It's not otherworldly. It's not a spiritual sanctuary outside of this world. It's this worldly. You have to really recognize that. You have to consider the importance of your body as sacred. You have to try to make the secular world sacred. You have to consider yourself, make the body healthy is not simply a physical exercise. It's mentally, aesthetically, spiritually significant. And you have to take the communities of various kinds, family, social organization, government, all these communities, the forms of human relatedness, absolutely critical. Major religious traditions all teach us how to go beyond all these conventional relationships. You have to leave the family in order to join a new family. Many religious traditions will urge you to do that. You have to leave this world and to understand the meaning of, the true meaning of human existence. You have to fix your idea on the transcendent reality rather than what's going on here and now. Now, the Confucian position is that you have to consider yourself rooted here and now, like a public intellectual. In this sense, the adjective Confucian has specific connotations. And these specific connotations are very much compatible with our idea of the public intellectual. It is in this sense the public intellectual is not a philosopher in a narrow Greek sense, not a prophet, not a guru, not a priest, not a monk, but, quote, a Confucian. But of course, a lot of people who are politically engaged, socially committed, and culturally sensitive never want to be a Confucian. They be an engaged Buddhist, concerned Christian, or concerned Muslim, or concerned scientist. That's fine. It is in this sense that the Confucian message, in a curious way, the Confucian message is not an exclusive message. It could be considered as a standard of inspiration. For some people considered significant, other people just don't want to pay much attention to that. And it is in this sense I want to read that rather delightful essay, Short Happy Life of Boston Confucianism. So the question is the following. Is it possible to be a Confucian without being East Asian? As so many philosophers have been Platonists without being Greek. Strangely enough, this is from actually from the jacket of Boston Confucianism. Strangely enough, many scholars would answer in the negative, citing the inextricable connection between Confucianism and East Asian culture. Boston Confucianism, this is the name of the book, argues to the contrary, maintaining that Confucianism can be important to the contemporary global conversation of philosophy and should not be confined to an East Asian context. It promotes a multicultural philosophy of culture and makes a contribution to Confucian Christian or Confucian Islamic or Confucian Buddhist dialogue, showing that the relationships among the world's great civilizations today is not a clash, as Samuel Huntington has argued, but an enlargement, an entanglement whose roots are worth sorting and whose contemporary mutual developments are worth promoting. So it is, on the surface, a joke, right? But the message is this. If now we want to bring the discussion, bring our discussion to the lived world in the Boston area, can we really talk about Confucianism as a portable tradition, rather than just a frozen tradition, tied to a particular ethnicity, particular historical moment, and particular culture? Now, Bob Neville argues in one particular area. I want to add one more. He argues that ritual propriety, the question of civility, as developed in Confucian tradition as Li, is eminently suitable to our environment, and it's very important to challenge us to understand our lived world here now. A few years ago, the Committee on the Study of Religion organized a series of discussions on ritual. And John Bertrand Ken, together with myself and others, talk about the Confucian idea of Li in terms of ritual. I think the consensus after that discussion is we should now think about ritual in reference to Li rather than Li in reference to ritual. Because the word ritual, no matter how broadly defined, Finger Red has done a very beautiful job in trying to develop, it's too restrictive in the English language. But the word Li in Chinese, in Confucian ideas, is much broader. It's idea of civility, idea of ritual propriety, idea of decency, much broader than the word ritual. So when you first say, wow, I'm very confused what Li is, because the word ritual or ceremonial does not evoke a very good sense of freedom of expression, of autonomy, of individuality. But now if you think ritual in terms of Li, the meaning of ritual becomes much broader. Not just a handshake, not just how you behave, but I think it is not possible for you to imagine a situation where ritual is totally absent and you can live as a human being. And if you broaden that ritual to all the signs, cultural signs, symbols, the various kinds of codes that we learn in order to function in society, everything, symbolic, we call the symbolic structure, any symbolic structure that will help us to communicate to the outside world or communicate to someone else, communicate to a close friend, is part of the ritual system. And of course, Bob Neville then talks about American pragmatism as a very good vehicle for us to understand that. But if you broaden your scope to understand ritual propriety in terms of civility, in terms of the symbolic mechanism of self-understanding and communication, certainly it's a very important contribution. But I will simply add, in 1 minute, the idea of the self as a central relationships. I already argued, I think, I don't know whether it's successful or not, that you can actually derive the idea of rights from duty consciousness and responsibility, if you do it right. In other words, you want those people who are in power, in control, to exercise their duty consciousness in order to recognize the rights available to every human being, including those who are marginalized, silenced, and underprivileged. Can we develop a very sophisticated notion about a person as a center of relationships without losing sight of the dignity of the person or the dignity of the individual? I think with the resources you have concerning Confucianism, you should be able, I don't think it's easy, you should be able to develop an argument that the idea of the central relationships is totally compatible with the notion of the person in terms of autonomy, independence, and dignity. There's no need for us to have this idea of radical individualism as isolated individual in order to preserve our autonomy, independence, and dignity. We can have a very sophisticated notion of the self as a central relationship while preserving those kind of values. So this may also be a possible Confucian reference to our present-day discussion in this area.